Let us rejoice together, my Father. Though divided in space, yet in spirit and charity we are united. And may you ever pray for C.S. Lewis. Bene advenistis ad colloquium nomine Pints with Jack. Vale, sodes et pater. Ecce pas prima episodi 20 in serie septima ubi de epistolis latinis quas C.S. Lewis scripsit discermus. Dear Pints with Jack listeners, thank you for downloading this episode of Pints with Jack, the podcast where we discuss the life and work of C.S. Lewis. This season, we've already read several letter collections from C.S. Lewis. Letters to an American Lady, Letters to Children, and today we wrap up the Latin letters of C.S. Lewis, which is why today's episode is entitled Vale, sodes et pater, a closing line from one of Jack's letters, which means farewell, comrade and father. All blessings, Andrew, David, and Matt. Salvete, gentlemen. Are you ready for the final golden session this season discussing Lewis's letters?
Well, David, I'm happy to state that we have made it through these multiple episodes without you asking me to read the Latin of the introduction. I was like, at some point he is going to, without me knowing, be like, Matt, you read this and make a fool of myself.
David, you could have asked, and then Matt, you could have just thrown it into AI and asked it to read the Latin in your voice.
That would have been clever.
Right,
literally, like just put my phone right here where you can't see it and move my mouth. No, I'm excited. I've really enjoyed this. Every book there's like different themes, and this one just the whole beauty of the crucified Christ and offering it up. I mean, there's just so much wonderful stuff in here. The piousness, the reverency. And so
they call it piety.
Piety.
And reverence.
Yeah.
Reverency.
Reverence.
Degeneracy.
I love the fact that we've rooted around in some of the corners. Speaking of which, I just got a lovely note from Jordan Duncan yesterday. I was on the Lesser Known Lewis podcast, and he sent me a coaster that I'm using today.
Yay.
Jordan sent me some stickers, one of which will go on my refrigerator at work, and also sent me, you guys have probably seen these, Reepicheep abroad spying at the bird and the baby. So there's
I have not, but that's so cool.
Isn't that awesome? So, and a lovely note. And so, yeah, I love that we've rooted around in these letters that probably don't get the most attention. But there's some just wonderful things happening in all three of these volumes. So yay for us.
Yeah. I think what's cool too is there's so much beauty. There ended up being no theological debate in this. Like Lewis just made a comment of his like calling that the St. Giovanni clearly understood it. They just didn't end up trying to do any sort of like, let's discuss the differences between Catholicism and Protestantism. And it was just a beautiful bond. And you could just see, I mean, honestly, my recommendation for people who haven't read it is just read it for the beauty and the love and the respect and the reverence and the piety. It's wonderful.
Yes. Well, and it also fills in kind of a corner of Lewis that we didn't necessarily know. As I pointed out at the beginning, he speaks in a different tone when he's speaking to a religious, right? To a minister, a nun, or a priest. And I love that we kind of get that side. And I think the Latin even invites a more august, uplifted tone. And so, yeah, it's just been great.
Well, what's everyone drinking today?
Well, before we move on to real quick, Andrew, you'll appreciate this. Margaret and I are going through Rainey's book per your suggestion.
Oh, good.
And David, I bought your love letters book, Letters to a Bride. Yeah. Took you guys' advice, and
good.
The Rainey book has been very fun.
Good. I'm wrapping up my last session in Rainey with the couple that's getting married that I'm going to perform the wedding for in April. So I've got that session this afternoon. But I am drinking my typical coffee, but I'm using these wonderful handcrafted mugs for the Refine retreat. Chris Camille every year puts on this wonderful retreat for women in Ohio, and my wife Lazo Major is on the board and gave the keynote talk yesterday and is fully involved. And so she's up in Shivery, Ohio, where it's in the 20s and 30s. But
appropriate.
Remind myself to pray in a caffeinated way. I'm using, and they do, there's a potter who does a different mug every year. So I'm drinking out of the Refine mugs in honor of her. and in prayer.
And looking at that mug, isn't that kind of very similar to the ones that you had sent of like potentially doing in the future with Pints with Jack in terms of style?
It's one of my many projects.
Yes, we're in no rush. But I remember you sent them to me, and I was in Chicago, and I was at this breakfast spot that has all of that style for their breakfast mugs. It was so cool.
I'm begging you, 12 ounces or more.
Absolutely.
Drink out of a
yeah, I know. That's a sip.
Yeah, exactly. So, what about you? What are you drinking today, David?
Well, I was up early. Alexander woke me up at 5:50, saying that he wanted to have cereal. And then as I was taking him downstairs, he fell asleep on me. So I then sat on the couch holding him, just keeping him asleep for a little bit longer. Because toddlers who don't get enough sleep are fun. So I am still drinking my morning coffee since I didn't get to drink it this morning because I was trying to not move a muscle so he'd sleep a little bit longer. And I also have a Best Day Brewing white Belgian style wheat.
Hey, Andrew, I got a Guinness, 0 alcohol.
Dang. I found a Total Wine in Sarasota that had not Foster's, but I got Samuel Smith Brown Ale and some Old Speckled Hen, but they were out of the Guinness non-alcoholic. So I have yet to have a non-alcoholic beer.
I gotta say, Guinness nailed the whole. It tastes so yummy with like no alcohol. I'm like very impressed with this.
Yeah, I was definitely very snobbish about non-alcoholic beer. I gotta say, I've been very impressed. It's kind of like when you try vegan food, and it's like this actually isn't too bad, and some of it is actually even excellent.
I'm not a big fan of vegan cheese, but I'm also a cheese snob.
I've tried some that are closer. It was funny. This was a long time ago, but I had dated this girl. She had gone vegan on me, and we broke up, not because of that. But when we met up again another time, I took her to a vegan restaurant for lunch, and she said, "Oh my goodness, this is just like real cheese." And I said, "No, it's not. It's pretty good. You just think it's like real cheese because you haven't had the real thing in so long."
Oh man. I did we would do a chili cook-off sometimes, or our class would host the community meal on Fridays, and so they said, "Hey, would you make vegan beans?" And so I did, and vegan chili. And so I went and I got the whatever the ground beef equivalent is, and I seasoned it up, and I made sure the texture was just right, and I put it off to the side, and almost none of the vegans would eat it, because it looked and tasted too much like real meat. And I'm like, oh my goodness. I think we have missed the point here, but okay, as you wish.
Well, actually, speaking of chili cook-offs, we had one at church a couple of weeks ago, and Marie came second through the anonymous voting system.
Nice.
Yeah, it was quite impressive. But
cheers to her.
This is good advice for all single guys out there. Marry someone who can cook. It's just awesome.
Yeah. Or just cook yourself, David? Which is what I
was going to say.
That's more work.
Cook, mate.
Hey, Matt, stop looking at pictures of Mary Margaret and do the toast.
I'm showing everyone, listeners, you can't see, I'm showing everyone engagement photos on my phone.
Good. Who are we toasting today, Matt?
Fabian Laura. Well, Fabian, as we talked about earlier, or Fabian, as we talked about earlier in this book, just the beauty of the way Lewis and them in St. Giovanni write and on the crucified Lord. May every day, no matter what comes, good or bad, may you just sit and offer it up at the foot of the crucified Christ. Cheers.
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 Well, and I just want to quickly give a shout out to the Davenant Institute, a bunch of wonderful reform guys up in North Carolina, South Carolina, who had me up to speak about, reason and imagination, the good, the true, and the beautiful through literature. And so what I talked about was the evil, the false, and the ugly, and C.S. Lewis's redemptive reversal. So we talked about Orwell and all the rest, and it was wonderful. We had a wonderful time. There were some fantastic papers given, and just a great group of folks. So lovely to be there and to be in the Southland as it started to bloom. Well, we're starting at the beginning of 1953, right?
We are indeed. So this is the final section of letters in the Latin letters of C.S. Lewis. And we finished last episode. There were a couple of letters that came in January of 1953. And our first letter, letter 21, comes just a couple of days later from St. Giovanni. It's pretty much just a letter of blessings. He says, "We are in holy days. May the Lord bless you and grant every good thing to you." And Don Giovanni also really comes across as a man who has an inkling. He has a suspicion that he's nearing the end of his life. He writes, "I am assured of the great love of your prayers, that I may carry out the divine will even to the end." And he says, "Time presses, truit or hora."
Yes, the hour flies. And I love the camaraderie of them. I have been thinking about, I think I said it, but it's kind of stuck with me, that when we meet people of different traditions, it's so easy to think about our differences when these guys are a model example of thinking about all that we have in common, all the love that we share, and our ardent desire on both sides that love may increase. And so Jack's been a good model for me.
And David, I just want to say here too, in this letter, I remember you in my prayers, which is the more obvious one, and sufferings. It's like a subtle way of saying I offer up my sufferings. I'm in there and I think of you and I offer them up for you, which I think is a powerful thing. I really love that.
Well, we're recording the last Friday before Holy Week, and I'm preaching on Sunday for Palm Sunday, and we read the Passion narrative, of course. And so I'm focusing on the sufferings of Christ and how he graciously allows us to fill up his sufferings. And so if suffering is unavoidable, one wise thing to do is to offer it up on behalf of others. And certainly our Lord did that.
And it's definitely a very Williamsy idea with coherence. And there's actually also going to be one example of this that's even greater than this that I didn't know until I was reading the Wikipedia page for Don Giovanni. But Lewis, he responds a little over a week later. And earlier they had spoken about an article. And Lewis says in this letter that he thought it was actually written by Don Giovanni using a pen name. And the Latin here, this is why it's great to have them side by side and occasionally just glance across and see what he writes, because you'd normally talk about someone's nom de plume, a French phrase meaning a pen name, and he translates it in Latin nomen plumae, which I just thought was wonderful. But yeah, it turns out that it wasn't written by Don Giovanni, somebody else entirely. And Jack quotes a maxim from The Imitation of Christ, saying that we should mark what is said, not who said it, which is something I absolutely, it's something I really love. I mean, obviously you should always take into account the context of a quotation, of a statement to understand where it's coming from. But the essential idea is that wisdom is hidden everywhere. And so you want to be hunting for wisdom wherever you find it.
Yeah. That idea of the personal heresy is embodied in a book by Lewis, a debate with E.M.W. Tilliard, who if you took Shakespeare, you probably read his Elizabethan World Order or something like that. But it was a debate about how much you should consider the biography of the author in reading the actual work. And actually, last Friday, when I was up in North Carolina, I got a chance to go up to Hendersonville to Stan Shelley and Son Books. And it's just this top floor of a warehouse building. And there they had, for $9,000, I did not buy it, The Personal Heresy, and it's signed by Lewis, given to A.C. Harwood. So it's an association copy given to his fellow Inkling and friend Harwood. And they had a page of Lewis manuscript from his notebook and marvelous, marvelous things. But yeah, it's not so much who says it, but what gets said in many accounts.
Lewis seems to have received an encouraging reply from Giovanni about the proposed book of prayer, which we mentioned in the last episode. But he then asks Don Giovanni a very important question about prayer. And it's a question that seems to have really been vexing him. So, gentlemen, what is this question?
Well, he's trying to reconcile the two different statements in the gospel, the Garden of Gethsemane, which is one of my favorite prayer models, which is, if it be possible. And then he asks for the prayer for the cup to pass. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. And I've always loved that model for prayer. But then Lewis brings up, but wait, there's another part in the gospel in Mark where he points out that it says, whatsoever you ask, believing that you shall receive, you shall obtain. And so he's really trying to figure out, how do you reconcile these two things? And he actually says, based on his reading, the doctors haven't really written on this. He says, how is it possible to say simultaneously, I firmly believe that thou wilt give me this, and if thou shalt deny me it, thy will be done? How can one mental act both exclude possible refusal and consider it? I find this discussion by none of the doctors.
And here he's referring to doctors of the church, so basically eminent theologians. He's not talking about the medical stuff.
Yeah. And if I recall, one initial thought I had was the I firmly believe part of it, whatever you ask, I think it says in full faith. I feel like maybe when the Lord is saying that, it's like, if you were perfectly aligned with the will of God in theory, and you had that fullness of alignment, which we don't have, whatever you ask will be done. Where the other one is like kind of recognizing and acknowledging, well, none of us do actually have that. Thus, thy will be done for the circumstances when we're not. Although the counter, as I speak out loud and process out loud, is Jesus did perfectly align with the will of God. And so he didn't have any need to say the other, unless he was speaking from his humanity side, but he was still perfectly aligned. So I guess we're back to ground zero. I have no idea.
That was a long verbal shrug. And I've got to agree. I mean, and in this same year, so this letter is from 1953. The same year, Lewis publishes an essay called "Petitionary Prayer: A Problem Without a Solution," and I think that it's just one of those paradoxes that we can't understand on this side. But I think, David, you may be able to offer some insight. My tendency, I mean, there's a couple of things. As to what you said, Matt, I want to be really, really careful to say the reason God didn't answer my prayer is because I didn't have enough faith, which puts the onus on us when the onus should always be upon Him. Even our faith is a gift from God. And so I've seen, especially prosperity folks and whatever, kind of, you have not because you don't have enough faith, and don't you feel terrible about yourself? And we already feel terrible enough about ourselves. So let's be careful with that. But also, I think that it's this problem without a solution. And my tendency is just to go, you know what, Lord, please, would you give me this? My model is more, be anxious for nothing, but in everything with thanksgiving. So I start out by refusing anxiousness, and then I next move to prayer in everything. And then I also include thanksgiving, not as a ticket to, get to the thing that I want, but because thanksgiving will change not only my heart, but sometimes the nature of the request. With thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. And so, David, if Alexander comes to you and says, Daddy, can I have a Lamborghini? And thank you for the way that you always provide what I need. And could I have a Lamborghini, please? You'll say no, right? But I think that our job with God is just to tell Him everything that we want, but then also trust Him to say no to the requests that are bad, or to adjust the requests. And maybe instead of a Lamborghini, you give Him a tricycle, and you've answered the essence of His prayer. So I kind of lean on, and I know that we should honor God and say, here's what I want. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. But His will be done. Especially if we have a willing heart. So I would say start with thank you, and then tell God everything that you want and let Him sort it out. Don't get attached to the results or think that my own faith or my intensity of belief that I'll get it is going to make God do anything, because that's just not how that works. But still, it's a paradoxical problem, and it was such a big one that Lewis abandoned writing the book that discussed it.
Well, I appreciate the fact that you went straight to Lamborghini for something that I would deny my son. Honestly, a popsicle would have been good enough. But I do view this question primarily through my lens now as a father. Mm-hmm. To understand a lot of the reasons why God might say no to me. To see the way my son asks for things, and often he doesn't actually fully understand what he's really asking for, or the fact that there is something so much better for him that I want to give him. And so when I read, whatsoever you ask, believing you shall receive, I think of that more as a statement of trusting in the goodness of God.
Yes.
That is never in question when I'm asking.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say, to cut to the chase, I think I would largely go down the route that Matt was going down in terms of understanding it, that these are not the only two statements in Scripture about prayer, and specifically about petitioning prayer. And there are other qualifications that you see elsewhere: asking in faith, being aligned with the will of God, etc. Now that does then hit the problem of, well, then if Jesus is all of those things, why does he say, but not as I will, but as you will? And there I would lean into the hypostatic union, the fact that he's fully God, but he's also fully man. And if Jesus could say that nobody knows the day and the hour, not even the Son, then there is a certain darkening or veiling in the hypostatic union of the divine person of the Son. If there is any kind of restriction there that you see expressed in the Carmen Christi in Philippians, that he took the form of a servant, etc.
Right.
Then it is only appropriate that Jesus prays like we pray. Right. So I mentioned on, I think it was a common room, I was talking about my current study of Islam, and one of the things that I hear most often from Muslim apologists is this question about the Son not knowing the day or the hour, and also about the fact that Jesus prayed to the Father. Yes, because that seems very strange to them. But the point is, if God became man, if he took on flesh, what kind of man would he be? Would he be an atheist? No, of course not. He would be a theist. He would continue the communication that he'd had with the Father and the Holy Spirit for all eternity. The only difference is that he is now enclosed in flesh. And as a consequence, he has taken on our limitations, and therefore will also pray like us in that way.
Yeah.
So that would be my take on this, but it is an exceptionally thorny problem.
Yeah. And it's one of those that we aren't going to resolve this side of eternity, I think. No. And I think that the principles of trusting in God and doing the best that we can and praying humanly. I also think that you're spot on with the hypostatic union. And the passage in Philippians that you're referring to is actually in the lectionary for Palm Sunday, who being very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, kenosis. Right? And took on the form of a servant and died even the death on the cross. God is omniscient, God is omnipresent, and by being in a physical body, God the Son necessarily limited the omnipresence of God, right? So the fleshness of Jesus, I think, limited some of the qualities of God. When the woman with the issue of blood touches him and he whirls around and said, "Who touched me?" I don't think it's a stage question. I think he really didn't know who touched him with the intent to get the power that went out from him. I don't think he knew. There are some things that Jesus seems to have known that were supernatural, but he didn't know every single thing, I think, and he was limited in the body. Nevertheless, his sonship, the second person of the Trinity, was not limited, but the body was limited. And we see that just because he died, right? God can't die, but God died. And so that hypostatic union is another one of those problems without a solution. And so I think that's right where we should leave it.
And if anyone thinks that we've made some missteps and committed various Christological and Trinitarian heresies, please write to us at contact@pintsofjack.com.
Please write to Matt. Please write to Matt.
And also, if you would like further discussion on this, check out the Less Known Lewis podcast. They had an episode on that essay.
Ah, fantastic. And cheers to them.
Letter number 23. Lewis writes again in March, and this letter is just wonderful. It's so sweet. So I'm just going to read a bunch of it. My dearest father, I was delighted as always by your letter. It was a wonderful thing and a strengthening of faith that two souls differing from each other in place, nationality, language, obedience, and age should have been thus led into a delightful friendship. So far does the order of spiritual beings transcend the material order. I so nearly made this the quote of the week. And you see in this next bit how Giovanni has affected Lewis over the course of their correspondence. He writes, "It makes it easier, that necessary doctrine, that we are most closely joined together alike with the sinner Adam and with the just one Jesus, even though as to the body, time, and place we have lived so differently from both. This unity of the whole human race exists. Would that there exists that nobler union of which you write. No day do I let pass without my praying for that longed-for consummation." So he's taken on Giovanni's prayer that they're all, and ultimately Jesus' prayer, that they all may be one. You see the effect that it's had on him.
Yeah, there's also a wonderful bit about paganism that I want to hear you touch on, and then I have a couple of comments.
I agree too.
He spends the rest of the letter talking about the state of the world, Christianity, and paganism. He writes, "Modern people neglect not only the law of Christ, but even the law of nature as known by the pagans. For now they do not blush at adultery, treachery, perjury, theft, and other crimes which the pagans and the barbarians have themselves denounced." And he says, people complain all the time that the world is turning pagan again. He says, oh, if only that were the case. And he contrasts a post-Christian world with a pre-Christian world. They're both without Christ, but in very different ways. And he compares it in the same way a virgin and a widow are similar. And when I was last at the Wade, I was reading the work of Father Andrew Caneo, an Orthodox priest with whom I was acquainted in San Diego. And I'd love to get him on the show because I'm going to quote him quite a bit in this final episode. I've kept all of these in my back pocket. But he wrote quite a bit about Lewis's Latin letters. And this is what he writes in relation to this passage. So this is Father Andrew Caneo. "The argument that paganism best precedes Christianity occurs repeatedly in Lewis's significant corpus of Latin writing. The letters he writes to the priest in Italy, Don Giovanni Calabria. It is appropriate that such a sentiment comes in the Latin tongue, for the truly classical spirit of C.S. Lewis saw no radical opposition between the religions of pagans and the religion of Christ, nor would he confine all of God's revelation to the Christian church. In this belief, he stands on the side of," he's going to list some church fathers here, "Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, and St. Augustine. He could well agree with Augustine that, quote, if those who are called philosophers, particularly the Platonists, have said anything which is true and consistent with our faith, we must not reject it." That's from De Doctrina Christiana. "How far from Tertullian and the more severe church fathers this is." Tertullian was the church father who said, "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?" He didn't like the mixing of Greek philosophy and Christianity. So, how far from Tertullian and the more severe church fathers this is. For the relationship between Christian belief and pagan philosophy varies significantly between the most representative Christian thinkers. As with Clement, Lewis believed pagan philosophy to be a handmaid to the Christian religion, a word which itself implies requisite subordination. About pagan literature, as distinct from philosophy, Lewis appears to go beyond many of the church fathers in his estimation of its compatibility with Christian belief. He not only accepted the elements of pagan philosophy in concert with Christianity, he also accepted elements of their myth and cult. Like Augustine, he saw a proto-evangelium in a poet like Virgil. Lewis incorporated both pagan myth, mythos, and philosophy, logos, in his Christian mythos logos, the Christian mythology of his fiction. With a sympathy for classical literature and philosophy, then, did he say to Don Giovanni Calabria, "I would almost dare to say, first let us make the younger generations good pagans, and afterwards let us make them Christians." A book such as Till We Have Faces becomes clearer in that light.
Now I can finally enjoy it.
And he goes on to connect it with the ecumenism that we've spoken about, because he says, moreover, Lewis's fundamentally Irenic attitude towards classical religion is also seen in his relations with other Christian denominations. If Lewis was able to support a certain continuity between pagan worship and Christian worship, how much more would he support the continuities between the various branches of Christianity? The Latin letters of C.S. Lewis to a Catholic priest enwrite and display this ecumenism.
Yes.
The language of the letters speaks of Lewis's synthesis of classicalism and Christianity. The spirit of the letters speaks of the unity he tried to point out amongst Christian denominations. I've got one more paragraph and then I'll let you guys at it. He writes later, "They err who say the world is turning pagan again," writes Lewis to Father Calabria in 1953. "Would that it were. The truth is that we are falling into a much worse state. A post-Christian man," Lewis did not have the benefit of the term postmodern, "differs from the pagan as the widow differs from the virgin," he adds. By this analogy, a post-Christian man is two removes from the pagan. In the last letter Don Giovanni receives from Lewis, and we'll get to that shortly, Lewis reiterates the point. Post-Christian Europe is in a different position from pagan Europe. Quote, "Many men of our time have lost not only the supernatural light, but also the natural light which the pagans possessed." By natural light, Lewis means the ordinary moral laws common to all civilizations. Thus he could write that even the pagans blushed at adultery, treachery, perjury, and theft. Even the barbarians rejected those things. Like a modern Jeremiah, Lewis laments that the post-Christian man and woman have, quote, "forgotten how to blush." Was Lewis almost attributing a piety to the pagans which did not exist? He almost reads into the ancient moral norms which sound uneasily Christian. Dante did the same, for it was the very subject of blushing which brought Lewis into debate with another Latinist 1 year after he had written the above letter. In fact, 1 year after Father Calabria died. Lewis's engagement with the classical things had yet another chapter. This time he would consider whether the pagan poet Statius had a foot in the Christian world as well. I honestly wanted to read you his entire essay because it's all fantastic stuff, but he did dwell on this topic a bit, so I wanted just to read all of that and then hand it over to you guys.
Yeah, well, I think that's entirely right. Lewis writes in 1952, it's for the Socratic Digest, an essay that's later published in God on the Dot called "Is Theism Important?" And he says almost the same thing. So he's been saying this, and as typical Lewis, when a theme occurs, it occurs everywhere and it occurs consistently. When grave persons express their fear that England is relapsing into paganism, I am tempted to reply, would that she were, so that same phrase. For I do not think it at all likely that we shall ever see Parliament opened by the slaughtering of a garlanded white bull in the House of Lords, or cabinet ministers leaving sandwiches in Hyde Park as an offering for the dryads. And if such a state of affairs came about, then the Christian apologist would have something to work on. For a pagan, as history shows, is a man eminently convertible to Christianity. He is essentially the pre-Christian or sub-Christian religious man. The post-Christian man of our day differs from him as much as a divorcee differs from a virgin. The Christian and the pagan have much more in common with one another than either has with the writers of the New Statesman. And those writers would, of course, agree with me. So he's saying, and he also then a couple of years later in 54, late 54, talks about the post-Christian world and that the great divide is not between medieval and Renaissance periods, but between our age and the previous age. And so we need to define and describe our terms, because pagan does not mean a hedonist or a reprobate or somebody who's out there in the South. Oh, that boy's a pagan. He's out there racing his car with loose women all the time. And a pagan is somebody who worships many gods, right? And who worships nature. And this would, of course, or worships the spirits in the natural. And this would kind of dovetail with some of Lewis's romanticism. But paganism, and I knew a woman who was Wiccan once, who became a Christian shortly thereafter, in part through Lewis. But paganism tells us about forces outside of ourselves that are greater than we are. It tells us about worship. It tells us about sacrifice. It tells us about ritual and meaning. And it is external rather than internal. It's external not in all the best and the right ways. And I'm not encouraging paganism, but like he says, would that it were, if Parliament opened with a religious act that was truly felt, appealing to gods in whom they believed, how much better a state would England be in? So, and I think that he finishes working out these ideas until we have faces, and he writes to Clyde Kilby about it. And so let's take a pagan in a pre-Christian world and see how that works out, but also shows how the light of God and the love of God is still speaking through the darkened understanding of pagans. So, I mean, this is right in the heart of a lot of what Lewis is thinking and talking about. Matt, I know that you were going to say all of that, so I'm sorry to have stolen your thunder. So,
no, that's exactly what I was going to say. Now, I was wrestling with, I was curious your guys' thoughts. Like, I feel like I'm a little bit in between like what Lewis is saying here. Like part of me was wondering if he is reading a little bit too much piety into it, but I'm just not as familiar. I think what you said, Andrew, was really fantastic. Genuinely, I was just thinking back to my time when I was in Israel and we were going to those ancient sites around the Roman period and some of the Greek sites that were pre-Christ period, and there was definitely the big emphasis on the sexual side, but it wasn't necessarily like adultery in that sense. But yeah, I wondered if it was a little bit too much piety reading into it.
Have you ever known any real pagans? Have you known any Wiccans?
My only experience is just going to like the sites of the 2nd, 3rd century BC, and then kind of them reading readings from some of the materials we have is kind of what the guide did for us, and talked about some of the rituals that were happening back then, and some of the love of the naked body, and but it wasn't. But I'm not like saying it wasn't. It really didn't come across as degenerate. It was truly. Maybe I take a bit of a Chestertonian view of. It was a love of worldly things, like a celebration of the body, a celebration of the sexual, the sun gods, the multiple gods. Sure.
It certainly is a worship of the creation rather than the creator, or tends more that way.
That's a good distinction.
But I think that if you read, I think it's chapter 13 of That Hideous Strength. It's the chapter that I was invited to speak about recently with Men Without Chess. Merlin is kind of pagan and Christian, right? He embodies the Druidic tradition, and also he is a Christian. And so these kind of forces are kind of trying to find their way with each other. And so I think that real paganism is a lot closer to Christianity than some of what gets extrapolated. There's a debate in Scandinavia in like 1000 AD, and the kind of argument is, could Thor beat up Christ? And kind of, so here are these people, competing with the qualities of their gods. So
it doesn't even take Christ. St. Boniface did it.
And I think and maybe here's a simple thing too, and I think you're right, Andrew, with that. I think Chesterton did say, and I don't remember this deeply, but I do remember thinking there was a lot of beauty to what he was writing. He goes, Christianity saved paganism from itself. And so he talked a lot about paganism, and that statement right there kind of offers some glimmers of like, there is a beautiful dynamic and relationship between paganism and Christianity, and enough of overlap for that to be true. But at the same time, the fact that it can save it from itself means the extreme version of it can turn into a negative state. And so maybe that's kind of how you thread that needle.
I wonder if the principle of, Christ came I've come not to discard the law, but to fulfill it. Right.
Yes.
And in some ways, what Christ does is he fulfills all of the good pieces of every religion. We see the same thing with Emeth, right? Whose name means truth. He's a pagan. But what he's worshiping is a God of truth, a God of mercy, a God of love. That's certainly not Tash, right? He's not a God of love and mercy and forgiveness. And so our dim feelings towards Christianity and towards Jesus, are some of what happens in what Tolkien calls splintered light, right? Any of the truth that we find in mythology is truth because God scattered it there, and because we are in his image, and our nature is to seek him out as best we can. And Lewis allows for no one can come to God except through Christ, but what through Christ might mean may be more than we think of it. So I don't want to get too far afield, but it's certainly fascinating conversation to have, especially with a future saint in the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
And if people would like to dig into more of this idea of not only Greek philosophy, but the Greek myths themselves foreshadowing Christ, thoroughly recommend the book by Dr. Louis Markos, who's been on the show before, The Myth Made Fact, Reading Greek and Roman Mythology Through Christian Eyes.
Yep, there's some good stuff in Paul F. Ford's Companion to Narnia, too.
That was such a good, fun conversation. Is the Louis Marcos one out, or is that coming out here
Yep,
after this?
it's out. He came onto the show to advertise it.
Oh, I love it.
Lou's a good friend, and cheers to him.
Cheers. Well, in August, Lewis drops St. Calabria a note prior to heading to Ireland, in which he expresses his great affection for his homeland, but also sorrow at the strife caused by people of dissenting faiths. He's got quite a few brutal lines, which come up several times in the upcoming letters, but here's the punchiest one. He says, "There indeed in Ireland is both yours and ours," so he's talking about Catholic and Protestants. "They know not by what spirit they are led." And then here's the line, "They take lack of charity for zeal and mutual ignorance for orthodoxy." They take lack of charity for zeal and mutual ignorance for orthodoxy. That sums up most Christian disputes on the internet. I'm just going to put that out there.
Yeah. Well, and this lack of charity has become even worse in the 70 years since this was written. And it's one of the things that I hammer on when I preach or when I teach. We're going to go into a political season, and there are forces, and they are evil, that want us to ramp up our distaste and our hatred, and our anger or our frustration or our scorn of people whose political positions, ethical positions we don't agree with. And the fact that these two brothers, who are divided quite sharply in terms of some crucial doctrines, are so loving towards one another is a good sign for us. Let's be on our guard against the lack of charity for others, especially as we're about to face an election. There's another thing in this, the last paragraph, though. Did you want to say something about the last paragraph?
No, I was just highlighting the quotation that I thought just flowed in naturally with what you were just saying, which is why I highlighted it and shook it.
Yeah. I think almost all the crimes which Christians have perpetrated against each other arise from this, that religion is confused with politics. For above all other spheres of human life, the devil claims politics for his own as almost a citadel of his power. Let us, however, with mutual prayers, pray with all our power for that charity which covereth a multitude of sins. And so let us continue to, I don't care how strongly you believe in your political outlook, let's make that secondary to our theological outlook, that we should render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God. And what we owe to God is to love him. And what we owe everybody else is to love them as well. That's a hard task. And when I find I'm busy myself with that, I don't have a whole lot of time or energy left for minor political debate.
In letter 25, we come to the final letter in this collection from Don Giovanni, who says that he's got some rare extra available time for spiritual exercises. And there's yet another quotation that I very nearly chose for the opening quotation of this episode. He says, "Divine providence binds us together with the sweet bonds of love, even if we have never known each other personally. But in love and mutual prayer, we know each other well, very well. In heaven, we shall see each other in the presence of God by the mercy of the Lord who has redeemed us." And it seems that Lewis's line in the previous letter about they take lack of charity for zeal and mutual ignorance for orthodoxy seems to have really struck a chord in the Italian saint. He writes in response, "These words the Spirit has inspired you with. They brought to my ear and my heart a profound agreement. Truly the Lord has bestowed upon you a special favor. Truly the Lord has something which he enjoins on you because of the gravity of our times, that you may labor for the good of the brethren, for the glory of God and Christ, and for the renewal of souls in charity. I call you blessed and always shall, because God wills to use you in carrying out his works."
Yes.
What a wonderful final letter for Lewis to have received from him.
And what a great model. I mean, let us notice in those people with whom we disagree, those Christians with whom we disagree, let us be on the lookout for how God is using them and how God is blessing others through them. I don't know about you, but the tendency is so easy to creep in to disparage them a little bit because they don't believe on our side. And I'm not saying that doctrine is unimportant. It's crucially important. But love is far more important than doctrine. And so let us be on the lookout for how God is working in others, in not only in other Christian folks, Christian denominations, but how God is at work in the world. He wants to reveal himself, and he wants all to come to him. And so those who are as close as our nearby denominational brothers and sisters, lots of space for great work with them.
St. Calabria ends this letter by begging a favor. He wants Lewis to answer a question, and I would summarize it like this. He's asking, why is the world messed up? What's the cause of all its problems, and what's to be done about it? And Lewis writes back about 2 weeks later, and he thanks St. Calabria for his letter and the book that was included, and he attempts to answer Giovanni's question. And he says that older people are always tempted to praise the past. But having said that, he does see the current age as being filled with particular dangers. And he attributes this to the large apostasy of the faith in Europe. And he retreats much of what's been said earlier about the passing away from Christianity and even pagan standards.
Mm-hmm.
It's not all bleak. He does note some virtue, however, in the new generation, particularly regarding courage and care of the poor. And regarding the remedy, he speaks about not only spreading the gospel, but what is needed to prepare people to hear the gospel. Mm-hmm. And this is the line I quoted earlier from Father Caneo, where Lewis says, "First let us make the younger generation good pagans, and afterwards let us make them Christians."
And I think that Lewis is not so much an evangelist as, the Latin is Preparatione Evangelica, the preparation for evangelism. Lewis, in his reason books, in Mere Christianity and Miracles and things, are giving people reasons that they can believe and trust intellectually in Christianity, and then imaginatively in Great Divorce and especially Narnia. He's focusing on the attractions of Christianity. And so he's... I think he's an evangelist for good reading, an apologist for the faith, but a proto-evangelist, somebody who is preparing people to believe. And if you think through what Lewis has done, you're ready for what God has to say in the gospel.
So David, would you interpret, I'm looking at the paragraph, and he's talking about the preparation for the gospel, like the step before spreading the gospel. And he's talking about the law of nature, essentially. And he uses an example. So for listeners, there's a very clear example that he gives. Before we can talk about how the gospel has this beautiful message of the forgiveness of sins, we have to understand we're sinning. And he actually uses moral relativity. And obviously, as anyone listening to this knows, today that's a big issue, is moral relativism. It's only gotten worse, arguably, since then. And so would you say it's just really important? Today, Christianity has become pretty charged, particularly because it's this blend between Christianity and the political world has frustrated sides, and Christianity is entering more one of the political sides more than the other. And so it leads to animosity towards it, he might be right that his prescription today is still the same. Like, let's not try to go spread the gospel directly. I don't want to say, no, let's not do that, but let's realize there's an incredibly important part of let's just discuss truth or logic or reason, or the fact that there is objective, even if you don't believe in God, we can at least state that you can't be well, you believe in God and I don't, and we can both just have our truth. I always start with people and go, one of those is going to be right when we die. Let's even just start with one of those is not truth. Now, you can hold to it and make an argument for why you believe yours is truth, and I do, but ultimately one of us will be right. We won't know necessarily on this side of time. And so I always try to start with that before even arguing or discussing with someone. We have to agree that this is not, we're not going to die and realize we were both correct. What are your thoughts on that section, I guess?
I would say he's talking about the abolition of man. He's saying that we need to have arguments for objective value first. We need a foundation of reality. And once we've got that, then we can start talking about everything else that comes after it. But when you're in a society that is effectively sawing itself off the branch that it's sitting on, there's no ground on which you can begin.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and Lewis, I think, is talking as a craftsman. He says somewhere about apologetics, he said, I looked and saw where the line was thinnest, and so that's where I went to.
Mere Christianity, it's the preface.
Yeah, in terms of defending and explaining Christianity. There weren't a lot of people doing that. There were some loads of evangelists. Billy Graham is operating around this time, but he is speaking to kind of post-Christian intellectual, the intellectual West, and shoring up reasons. I mean, I've used the quote too often, but Chesterton says the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting, but found difficult and left untried. And Lewis is saying Christianity is not wanting, right? And it is difficult, but in the right ways. And here's why you should try to attempt that difficulty. In some ways, Lewis is addressing the problem that Chesterton enunciated, and he's discussing with Calabria what he's doing.
Love it.
The next important thing to note is that Calabria dies. He died on the 4th of December, 1954. And when I was reading his Wikipedia page, it says that on the 3rd of December, he offered himself to God to die in place of the Pope, Pius XII. So he'd heard that the Holy Father was sick and said, Lord, take me instead. And the Pope rallied and he recovered, and he later learned of Calabria's death and sent an official telegram of condolence. So whatever you might want to read into that, I'll leave it to the listeners, but it does seem to be very coherency, like Charles Williams, and Lewis's own prayer that his wife would be healed. And as his wife was being healed, she was gaining calcium in her bones as he was losing it.
Yes. The doctrine of substituted love.
Now, not knowing that he died, Lewis writes again that December, and probably prompted by the new liturgical season. This is something I'm noticing as the letters go on. They're more particularly around Christmas and Easter. And Lewis writes, Good heavens, dearest Father, what a long silence there has been between us. And he tells him about his upcoming move from Oxford to Cambridge University, commenting that Mary Magdalene will remain his patroness. And he speaks very positively about Cambridge, about how Christianity is more important there, and they have fewer communists and fewer logical positivists. And those are the people that Lewis writes against, particularly in The Abolition of Men. And he has this line, which I love. Know at least that I always pray for you, and especially at this time when we are preparing for the dearest of festivals, the Feast of the Holy Nativity. And here's the quote of the week. Let us rejoice together, my Father. Though divided in space, yet in spirit and charity we are united. And may you ever pray for, and then he signs it off, C.S. Lewis. And not only is that a lovely line, I chuckled when I reread it, because it made me realize that he had unknowingly been praying for the dead and asked for saintly intercession all in one.
That's funny. I wonder how that moved Lewis in that moment. Because they really did have a deep bond, and it really, Andrew, you said this in the beginning, it is super different than any other side of Lewis that I've ever seen. And any of his other writings, any of his other letters. Now, I've not read most of his letters other than the ones that we've done here. But from what I've come across, it was just another side to Lewis. And I think of, was it Lewis who said, when a friend dies, a part of you can kind of, like that part that he brought out in you can sometimes die a little bit.
Four loves. Yeah.
Four loves.
It's now that Charles is gone, I don't have more of Ronald, I have less of him. I'll never see the particularly Caroline look on Tolkien's face. Caroline referring to Charles, right? That our friends become exponential. It's not only, it's when you guys gang up on me, or we gang up on David, or David and I gang up on Matt. Listeners, we did a little of that before we started rolling. It was me, it was Matt, it was you and me ganging up on David that led to the important concept of Batesian rigidity. It was me kind of taking the mick. But it's also, a real gift of the show. And so, yeah, he loses a little of that now that he's gone.
And at this point, Lewis continues his correspondence with Verona with Don Luigi Pedrolo, a member of Giovanni's congregation. And Lewis sends him his condolences and consolation, because he clearly had a letter from Verona explaining that he had died. And Lewis responds, Don Giovanni, indeed, from the troubles of this world, which he used to feel most heavily, has happily passed over into his own country. To you, without doubt, the grief is keen. And he thanks Don Luigi for a photograph of Don Giovanni, which the community had apparently sent him. And Lewis says this: his appearance is such as I had imagined, the gravity of age well mixed and combined with a certain youthful vivacity. And at the moment, I'm reading a lot of George MacDonald in preparation for George MacDonald month at the end of this season. And this is a very common feature both in MacDonald and also in Lewis. Whenever they're writing about people who are holy, they are always described, well, not always, very often described with this curious mix of old age and youthfulness. And the classic example is George MacDonald himself in The Great Divorce. He's described as being in some ways very old, but in some ways very young. And in George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblin, you have the same thing with the great-great-grandmother.
Well, and practically speaking, I just love those Christians who get older in their faces, but younger in their eyes. You know, the people who get closer to eternity, they outwardly, the body is wasting away, but inwardly their spirits are renewed day by day. And there's a youthfulness to some of the great saints, especially as they get older. And I hope that there's always that twinkle in me as well. I hope I continue to take myself less seriously as the years go on.
We'll make sure of that.
I won't hear you, but you know, I'll welcome it.
All right, Grandpa. Jack signs off the letter, promising to pray for them all and asks for their prayers too. And then there's a period of silence. 5 years later, Lewis sends Don Giovanni another letter, providentially enough, during the week of prayer for Christian unity, which was so loved by Don Giovanni. And Lewis thanks Don Luigi for a book that he was sent about the life of Father John, and saying that he hopes it'll shed some light on some of the mysterious things that Don Giovanni alluded to, particularly with regards to his suffering.
And I don't know, is he talking about Don Giovanni? Because he calls him Patris Giovanni. Maybe that's the Latin for the Italian Giovanni.
I kind of want to read this book now about Don Giovanni because...
How's your Italian, Matt?
Wonderful.
Okay, good. You'll be fine.
Buongiorno.
Yes.
Don't worry, guys. I know that was not Latin. If any listeners like Matt's an idiot.
No, it was Italian. That was what I was challenging you to.
Oh, you were? Okay. For some reason, I thought I heard Latin. You probably did say Italian. Well, then I'll say buongiorno, principessa. It's about the only Latin I know. I mean, Italian. I'm just screwing up. It's all Greek.
Carrying on.
Keep digging. Lewis writes again that year on Holy Saturday, just before Easter. And apparently, he'd been asked about what he's working on at the moment, and he says that it's the Four Loves. Interestingly, that's the passage that Matt and Andrew were alluding to about when one friend dies, you lose something of your friends who are still alive. Naturally, Lewis asks for prayers because he says that this work that on the Four Loves is a work full of dangerous hazard, as Flaccus wrote.
Yeah. And so it's interesting, the timeline, by the way, of the Four Loves is he gives the talks, 4 talks on love in 1958. And then I think later the same year begins writing the Four Loves. And so in 59, the book is underway, but not yet done. And this is a thriving time for him and for Joy and for Warney. I think they've got 3 or 4 different book projects going. Warney, of course, wrote several books on French history that were fairly well received. And at one point in the letters, they talk about it. Lewis and Company, authors or something like that. And our house, the Kilns, is practically a book factory. And so they are all happily writing and helping each other out. And so that's part of what's going on there.
And at the end of that year, there's another letter from Lewis, and he explains about the return of Joy's cancer. May it please the Lord that, whatever his will for the body, the minds of both of us may remain unharmed, that faith unimpaired may strengthen us, contrition soften us, and peace make us joyful. It's a good prayer during a time of suffering.
Yes.
In Easter the following year, Jack sends a few lines saying that life is difficult, but, quote, nonetheless, we lift up our hearts for Christ has risen. And the following January, Jack responds to an inquiry about Don Giovanni's letters. And he explains that he no longer has them or copies of them, saying, "It is my practice to consign to the flames all letters after 2 days. Not, believe me, because I esteem them of no value, rather because I do not wish to relinquish things often worthy of sacred silence to subsequent reading by posterity." That's what C.S. Lewis wrote on the 3rd of January, 1961.
Mm.
And he has a dig at researchers who dig up stuff and says it's the last thing that he wish would happen to Don Giovanni's letters.
Yeah, I put in the margin of my book, for nowadays, inquisitive researchers dig out all our affairs and besmirch them with the poison of publicity. And I put in my margin, ahem, because that's what I do. Incidentally, the grave trouble that he's in April of 1960 is not only the return of Joy's cancer, but fewer than 2 months later, she passes away. So that's the difficulty.
And that's how he ends this letter. Here, after the preamble, he says that his wife has died in July, and he asks for prayers. But he does sweeten the ending a little bit in a way I think Don Giovanni would have liked, because he notes a recent meeting between Pope John the 23rd and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who then I think was Geoffrey Fisher. And it's just a lovely touch. You get to see the echo of Don Giovanni in Lewis.
Yeah, Lewis, by the way, had a lot of dealings with archbishops. He was asked by various archbishops and bishops to do a lot of speaking and being on panels and things like that. And yeah, Geoffrey Fisher served from 1945 to 1961. So this is towards the end of towards the end of his reign as archbishop.
And then we come to the final letter in April of 1961. Lewis himself has been ill, and he thanks Don Luigi for his prayers for both him and his deceased wife. And I love the fact that this is how it ends, with a mixture of Christian and pagan imagery all wrapped up together. He writes, "I know that you pour forth your prayers both for my dearly longed-for wife and also for me, who, now bereaved and as it were halved," reference the pagan mythology that your soulmate is someone that you've effectively been cut apart from. So, now bereaved, as it were halved, journey on through the vale of tears. Catholics in particular will be very familiar with that phrase, alone.
Scio vos preces effundere. I know that your prayers will flow out. Et pro desideratissima. Desideratissima. The most desired. Uxore mea, wife mine, my wife. My most beloved, my most beloved wife. Et pro me qui jam orbatus et quasi dimidiatus, cut in half.
Have you ever seen that?
This is a very touching moment. You're ruining it. Stop it.
Yes, you are.
Have you guys ever seen that Friends episode where she's trying to teach Joey French, and she actually can speak, and she's like, "Pas de fousse, samada," and then she's like, "Repeat after me," and Joey's like, "Pas de babou, shubadou." He's like, "It sounds the same to me."
Phoebe's doing it. And then there's a...
I'm sorry, proceed with your beautiful moment.
See, for my mind, I went to Claro, Verona.
I'm gonna pretend like I know what that is.
Is that too an obscure reference? I'm not even going to say what it is. If anyone knows that reference, send me an email. contact@pintswithjack.com.
Yes.
And it's an amazing movie.
I think what I love is Andrew's looking this up about these letters is, listeners, we really, David, even in the beginning of this one, we anticipated having plenty of time to finish this. There's just so much subtle meat in all of these. Every one of our recordings has blown past our normal time, and it's been worth it and wonderful. It's just kind of a commentary of just how you can almost underestimate the gold that's in these things.
Mm-hmm.
It's wonderful.
What I was looking up is one of my favorite Psalms, Psalm 84. Blessed is the man whose strength is in thee, in whose heart are thy ways. The English translation of Coverdale says, who going through the vale of misery use it for a well. But the Latin says, in vale lacrimarum, in loco quem posuit. And as he passes through the valley of weeping. So this phrase comes from the Latin Psalter. From Psalm 84. As they pass through the valley of weeping, they make it a place of springs. And this is a point that I often touch on about the grace of God. as we go through the valley of weeping, and then they go from strength to strength till each appears before God in Zion. So it's an upward journey, but it goes through valleys to new heights. And as they go through the valley of salt water, of weeping, they make it a place of springs, of sweet water, and the transformation of the difficulties of our life that God will turn into sweetness is something that Lewis is hoping for even here. And certainly his reflections upon Joy's death, which are published in A Grief Observed, have provided great comfort for many at Lewis's own cost. Talk about coherence with that.
And the idea of turning salt water into sweetness. Where the waves grow sweet, doubt not, reap a cheap. There is the utter east. Well, I wanted to close this by reading a few more paragraphs of Father Andrew's Cuneo's work that I found at the Wade. And if anyone wants to look it up, it's Selected Literary Letters of C.S. Lewis. That's what his work is called. And I'm going to try again to try and get him on the show because I really love this.
If you've got an email for him too, just let me know. I met him once with Walter Hooper and Michael Ward at the Wade Center. And I think that was before he was even Orthodox, but a wonderful guy. And he and Michael Ward helped Walter edit the collected letters. So they've made an invaluable contribution in the Lewis world.
Well, there were just like 3 different paragraphs I wanted to read because it touches on some aspects of the Latin letters that I think are important, but we didn't really quite get to. Firstly, it's about Lewis's Latin style. He writes, Lewis clearly writes in his Latin as a 20th century Englishman and makes no effort to write in the high style of Cicero or with the sentence length of Caesar. Lewis's sentences are generally short. Know that your house of priests is mentioned daily in my prayers. When his sentences unfurl, phrasing is nevertheless tight and sequential. He does not avail himself of the immense flexibility of the word order in Latin. Lewis's intention is simplicity, which is exactly what he did in English. His deceptively simple style in English asks for and receives a simple, clear Latin style. In this way, his Latin writing is more like a medieval scribe than a Renaissance humanist. I think that's a very important sentence and tells you a lot about Lewis's own vocation as the new Boethius. There is a flavour of the spirituality of Thomas à Kempis throughout his letters, perhaps giving an indication of his Latin reading at the time. This and other medieval authors are surely the substance of Lewis's private and professional reading. And Father Andrew also spent some time talking about the sources of Lewis's Latin, talks about his reading of the Vulgate and how in these letters he would typically just mentally translate the King James Bible into Latin rather than go and find his Vulgate and quote it directly. He also discusses Lewis's ecumenism, saying that when Lewis drew upon scripture in the Latin letters of Father Calabria, it was rarely for polemical purposes. The Anglican and the Catholic may have been writing in lingua catholica, so in the Catholic language, Latin, but Lewis was determined to avoid all issues of denominational conflict, and that's what you've been talking about, Matt. The Latin correspondence, nevertheless, does add an understanding of Lewis in relation to Catholicism. The Latin letters can be placed alongside the letters to Father Peter Millward, Dom Bede Griffiths, and Mary Van Dusen to show that Lewis was determined not to discuss the issue of Catholicism at length. It is Lewis's silence on the issue that speaks the loudest. In the Latin letters, as in Mere Christianity, one finds Lewis, first of all, denying his ability to treat the issue of schism. However, I'm a layman, indeed, the most of laymen, least skilled in the deeper questions of sacred theology. Next, Lewis deflects the issue of partisan theology to those who are qualified to address them. These are things that are best treated by bishops and learned men. In conclusion, he says he will only focus on the areas of denominational agreement. In this way, by fraternal agreement, charity, and prayer, Lewis treats the Protestant Catholic schism. His treatment is oblique, perhaps from the standpoint of disputation, much to Matt's chagrin, but it is sharp and direct from the standpoint of what he thought would actually heal any schism.
Can I say something here too before we go on to the next section? Reading that and now having gone to the letters, I will say, because I think there's plenty of people that are doing ecumenical debates and dialogues. I love this in the sense that there needs to be more of this. It's not that you can't have those dialogues and debates. I mean, people do need to hash out doctrine and theology, but if that's become 95% of it, rather than like watching the charity between these two men, the affirmation, the love, that just, imagine someone who has a complete animosity for the other side, but reads this, that's going to thaw them more than watching another debate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that the closeness that Lewis had, I mean, Cuneo mentions a few correspondence partners, but you also have Mary Willis Shelburne, who was Catholic. You've got Bede Griffiths, you've got Humphrey Havard, his doctor, and of course Tolkien. And so there were a lot of Catholics that he hung out with, and it's interesting for me to see the trajectories of people such as Walter Hooper, Michael Ward, Holly Ordway, who were Lewisians and Anglicans before becoming Roman Catholic. And so certainly Lewis knew how to have conversation in a way that wasn't acrimonious. So
Produced more light than heat.
yes.
My favorite section of what Father Andrew writes, though, is this. I think I actually even went over to our Father Andrew in the Wade Center and went, read this, it's great. Lewis's periodic style, his moral sentiments, his clauses balanced by antithesis, these are the most classical elements of his English. Charity begins at home, so does uncharity. Good philosophy must exist, if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. His style brings the reader face to face with his meaning, yet softens the contact by a symmetry of clauses. Moreover, the balance and poise of his statements use nothing other than his native Anglo-Saxon vocabulary. This means that classical elements of his style are packaged in strong monosyllabic diction. For instance, we must lay before God what is in us, not what ought to be in us. 15 monosyllables with only one exception. The result is a style full of short, well-cadenced, but eminently memorable sententiae. And this is the final line. This is my favorite bit of his entire work. Lewis is English in diction, Christian in content, but Roman in his ability to create a good adage.
Yeah. Well, and I think that one of the things, and maybe he mentions it elsewhere, one of the things that I found missing from Father Cuneo's quote was Lewis's background in the classics. So when he is 15 years old, he's with Kirkpatrick, and he starts reading Latin from the Aeneid. In fact, I've been, carrying around in front of my computer Lewis's Lost Aeneid, and A.T. Reyes, who worked with Walter as well, has got some interesting comments about Lewis's Latin. So Lewis translated portions of the Aeneid, and Reyes not only gets those translations, but also finds other phrases that from the Aeneid that Lewis uses and translates in his letters and elsewhere, and compiles them all. His background in the classics was exceptional, and he got a first-class degree in classics, which meant not only Latin writers, political, philosophical, religious, but also Latin prose composition. So he was translating from English into Latin, a great deal. And so and Kirkpatrick said that he was the best translator of classical plays that he'd ever met, and compares him to some of the greats in England. So his commitment to Latin is profound, and the Latin letters, I think, help him to kind of flex that muscle that he's had and developed over many, many, many years.
As we wrap things up, do you guys have anything else you want to share in the miniest of retrospectives on the Latin letters and all of the letter collections we've done so far this season?
No, I would just say if you listen to this, even though we brought in a lot of the key content, because I think and unique to the Latin letters, probably half the value is just the beauty of the relationship and the reverency and piousness. Just kidding. I would just really encourage people to not just experience this from our perspectives, but to experience it in its own purity.
Yeah. The other thing I would say, this is not me plugging eBay, although I'm always doing so. Lewis's collected letters are a treasure, and you can pick up volumes 1 and 2 in a slipcased paperback for a relatively reasonable amount. Volume 3 is going to run you $300. I've got a couple of copies. They're not up yet, but I'll put them up. But I would just highly suggest readers get at least collected volume 1 and 2, maybe collected volume 3 on whatever your electronic reading platform is, Apple Books or Kindle or whatever, and just relish them. And Lewis's letters are a great reading experience in that you can just grab a book, open them anywhere, and read for a bit. And you don't have to, they're not necessarily thematic. You don't have to keep track of characters or whatever else. They're a great pleasure. I often think of it as a great pleasure while eating. You can just pick up that book, open it anywhere, and have a really enjoyable experience with Lewis in his great prose, and his wit and his humility. And especially towards, after the 40s, and his succinctness of style. He's writing so many letters that he gets right to the point, and they're marvels of succinctness and as well as good humor and all the rest. So great stuff in any of Lewis's letters that you pick up. I will remind readers that Letters to Malcolm, Chiefly on Prayer, is Lewis's successful book on prayer. He finally completed a book on prayer. He abandoned the one he talked about with St. Giovanni. But there is no real Malcolm. So Lewis, this is an imagined correspondence like the Screwtape letters. But Letters to an American Lady, Letters to Children, Latin letters, any of the collected letters, Yours, Jack, which Paul Ford did, any collections of letters are a great thing to kind of have on hand, and especially if you're sitting there waiting for an oil change or whatever, a great way to spend a fruitful few hours or a few minutes.
Finally, since this is the last letter collection that we're going to be doing this season, I just wanted to remind everyone that at the end of this season, we're going to be discussing Letters from Jack, the book which we brought back into print, which was produced by the honors class of Azusa Pacific University with the help of Dr. Diana Glyer. I have a tiny number of copies left. If you would like a copy, send me an email. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a video chat session at the end of the season for all of our Patreon supporters and also anyone who purchased the book. We're going to invite you to join us.
Excellent.
But I hear the call for final drinks. So I'd like to thank our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah, all of our listeners and Patreon supporters, particularly our top tier supporters, Mary Margaret, Future Mrs. Bush, Aldo, Alex, James, Matt, Erica, Joel, Amanda, Thomas, Bud1, Bud2, Shane, Kay, Paul, Gary, Stephen, Kelly, Chris, John, James, Kate, Peter, David, Angela, and Rowdy. We pray for you all every single time an episode is released, and remember our prayer request Slack channel often. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please pick up one of the few remaining copies of Letters from Jack. Join us at the end of the season for a video chat. Maybe read it over a snack, because eating and reading are two pleasures that combine admirably.
Admirably.
So somebody said.
Yes.
And so with that, adietis nos si placet in proximo episodio.
Ubi pergemus ire et porro altius.
Uco baradupo.
Barabaratudu. Et porro
intrinsecus. Valete.
Valete.
Valete. I couldn't help myself.
Idioticus.
It's all great to you.
I understood that, Andrew.
It's a made up Latin word, so that's why I figured you.
I figured it was actually.